begin our slideshow. So good evening to everyone on the call. I am so thrilled to be here with you tonight. I'm Dr. Donna Keel from DePaul University, and it is genuinely an honor and a pleasure to bring you this session tonight, which we've entitled Rise, Educators Rise for Racial Equity. And I really thank you in advance for taking time out of your schedules, this time right before the holiday season. And I know for those educators who are in person, you have one more day in person before a break. And those of you remote, you have one day before a break. And so I know how exhausted and taxing it is, but there is no greater reason to come together on a Thursday night at 5 o'clock than to talk about racial equity in our schools. What we know is that racism is affecting every element of our society, our systems and our organizations, and most especially our schools. But what we know more than anything is that educators like you, both teachers and leaders and support of our students, are the answer to changing that. You're the answer to shifting so that we can rise for equity for all students, and so that diversity, equity, and inclusion become the norm that permeates all of our educational endeavors. And so tonight I want to in advance thank the Barra Education Foundation, in particular Sheila Smith, for her work with DePaul. They are the grantees from the Teaching with Primary Sources Library of Congress grant, and we are subcontractors at DePaul University. And together with Barra Education Foundation, we've created the RISE program for educators that you're part of tonight. And let me, as we begin tonight, introduce our my colleagues who will be sharing in and who are the experts in racial equity. Dr. Tina Curry. Tina, just wave physically. Dr. Tina Curry is an equity coach, an instructional coach, and also a CPS teacher. She is also one of the most inspirational educators I've ever met in my life, and Tina will be helping lead this session. Professor Felicia Shabiri, Felicia, if you could physically wave. Felicia, too, is an equity coach. She's a wellness coach, a life coach. She's a best-selling author, adjunct at DePaul. I also forgot Dr. Curry is also an adjunct at National Louis besides DePaul. And Dr. David Bates. So David, if you can wave. Dr. David Bates is an assistant professor of history at Concordia University. He is also a former coordinator for Teaching with Primary Sources Library of Congress grant program, and a history expert. And all three of them together are incredible human beings, and I'm happy to share them with you tonight. As we begin tonight, I want to give us a pause for a moment of inspiration that can remind us why we're here and what this work is all about. So if you give me a second here as I shift some technology. So.
We face the difficulties of today and tomorrow. I still have a dream. Yeah. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
So we too have a dream, and at DePaul and at the Barra Education Foundation, it's a dream to be able to help our educators to use the Library of Congress as that tool where we can all then have that equity be part of who we are in our classrooms, and so that our young people become the future. And so as we begin today, I want to talk to you a little bit about, very quickly, the format of RISE. And so what RISE is this incredible 4-step strategy for racial equity within our schools, and racial equity that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so RISE stands for a 4-step process of reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy. It's in each of those elements, and we're going to talk tonight more specifically about reflection and inquiry, where teachers and leaders within our school systems can be that change that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about so many years ago, and where we can impart in our students that passion for equity, and where we can end the divide of racism that has long plagued our country. And so let me talk to you practically about how RISE works for those of you who are educators on this and who want, I know as a former teacher and principal myself, I always want to know what do I have to do and what am I going to get out of this? RISE consists of monthly webinars like this one for K-12 teachers and leaders and any administrators or staff that want to become an anti-racist ally. It's also an online micro-credential. So you'll have 1 hour, once a month, synchronous webinars, but also the opportunity to work with an asynchronous micro-credential online, where you would earn a digital badge as a racial equity educator that can be displayed on your social media, on your school's website, on your own LinkedIn. When someone clicks on that digital badge, it'll take them to the competencies that you'll have earned through this program. Also, if you're a teacher, you earn 2 CPDU credits per webinar. If you take the micro-credential, you earn 25 CPDUs. So those of you who are licensure folks, it's well worth your time. Today, we're going to do 3 main things tonight and use our time very wisely that you're sharing with us. We're going to first demonstrate the first strategy of RISE, how to use reflection with Library of Congress primary sources as tools to dismantle racism. We're going to examine our own personal experience of race, because race is a deeply personal experience and racism is a personal experience. And we're going to define race and racism as a foundation for equity-driven teaching and learning. And so I'm going to turn it over to Felicia, who's going to give us some guideposts for our work tonight.
Yeah, just get me into the.
No, not the link.
Hello, everyone. And I want to say first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to welcome you here and to let you know that this space we bring to you, we've created a space where our hearts are open to you, and we ask that you open your hearts and your mind. Know that there is no judgment whatsoever that is taking place here. We are going to go through this webinar, and there will be times where we'll ask you questions, and we just want it to just flow naturally and just completely organically. It's all about learning and growing and realizing that we're here today, and the work that is before us is work that is going to take some time, right? Because we're dismantling so many beliefs and programs that we've been carrying. So I appreciate you for being here tonight, and let's begin.
So I'm going to shift over to Dr. Bates, who's going to take us through equity and primary sources. David?
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to talk briefly about primary sources and what they are. And so some of you may already know this, some of you may not, but the way that the Library of Congress defines primary sources is the raw materials of history. So these are original documents, artifacts, objects that were created at the time that you're studying. So if you're thinking of examples here, there's a lot of obvious ones, something like a photograph, a newspaper, a journal, congressional debates, things like that. But there's lots of other types of sources too that would also be considered primary. So things like audiovisual sources, TV advertisements could be a primary source. Social media posts can be a primary source. Podcasts could be a primary source. But the most important thing is, as you see in that second bullet point, primary sources are the best way for us to get a direct link to the past and get a sense of what it was like to be alive at a specific time in history. So if you're interested in something like, for example, the civil rights movement, There are certainly no shortage of textbooks that can provide you with context, but primary sources are the way that give you a direct link to what it was like to live through that era as much as we, from our distance of time and space, can understand that. So what do Library of Congress primary sources do for you in terms of anti-racist education? So for one thing, primary sources are, they force critical thinking. If you hand a student a photograph or a document from the 1960s, it's not like a textbook, right? It doesn't explain itself. It forces the student to do some of the work of excavating where that source came from, who created it, what was going on in the time period, what the biases of it might be, what the point of view might be. So from the beginning, you're getting students into a critical mindset, thinking about the source in a way that's a little bit deeper than just kind of receiving information like they would otherwise. And more than that, it forces us to confront the realities of the past in a way that's much more direct than a secondary source, which would be something like a textbook, right? So it forces us to look at the words and deeds of people in the past in a very direct and honest way. And I think it's a really good way to force us to stay grounded in that and forces us to have maybe some difficult conversations about what was going on in the past. And that helps us carry forward the work of equity, inclusion, diversity that we're pushing for here today.
So what we want to do next is David's going to
Yeah.
actually walk you through an example that you can use with your students right away. So we want to make this practical. Those of you who are classroom teachers, you can take this right into the classroom tomorrow if you wanted to, or certainly in a remote teaching situation that shows you the power of primary sources with racial equity.
So this is a political cartoon that appeared in Harper's Weekly in the 1870s. And so the first thing that I'd like you to do is, this is the Library of Congress primary source analysis tool, which is observe, reflect, question. And I'll give you a chance to take a look at that. Yeah, there it is right there. So this is freely available. You'll have access to this. But if you wanted to use this as a worksheet with your students, these are the 3 steps. So what do you observe? How do you reflect on this? And then what are your questions? So if we go back to the source, we can practice this really quick. So again, the only background information I'm giving you is that this is a political cartoon from Harper's Weekly from right after the Civil War in the 1870s. So really quick, if you just want to type a few things in the chat here. So what do you see? What's something you notice? What does it make you think about? Okay, if you wanted to reflect on this source, what are some deeper implications of this, some significance? And then what are some questions you have? What does this make you wonder about? So take maybe 30 seconds or so, think about these questions, and then you can just kind of like free associate in the chat and just type some things in there as they come to your mind.
And as you're doing that, what we'd like to do is to talk to you about the RISE process. So we know that we've engaged students in inquiry, but we also know that a picture like the one that you see in front of you has an emotional connection. Tina, do you want to share from the lens of an African-American what happens when you view this?
So my first experience with looking at primary sources from Library of Congress in preparation for the type of work that we do, I remember having to go through this process myself. And when I was asked the first question, what do I see? I was able to like name what I saw. And then it asks, what are you thinking? And I found myself not being able to go to that cognitive space because I had so many emotions and I was feeling so many things. And then I realized as a learner that my emotions were manifesting themselves in my mind and in my thinking, and that my emotions are a part of my intellect and they don't necessarily have to be separate. And so I just want to say that when you're planning to use these sources, just think about that for your students, for students who may enter that learning space in the way that I did.
So what we've done with RISE is given teachers this added tool. So what we know from primary source analysis, and those of you who've used it in the classroom in the past know that primary source analysis calls the student to analyze that piece, that document, that artifact. What we've done with RISE is move to a second kind of analysis. So first we analyze the document, then what we need to do is to analyze our own personal reactions and beliefs, biases and stereotypes that are inherent in how we view a document. That gets underneath racism, as well as bias, as well as inequities in our own past history and how we react. So what we do is add 3 significant questions to that analysis component. So first we do is, as Dr. Bates mentioned, we look at what do you see, what do you think, what do you wonder about? But now, when we look at it again with our students, we say, what do you believe? What are those beliefs that you have, the experience of racism in your own life, the racial scripts that were in the house where you grew up, or in the experience when you grew up that are associated with what you're feeling as you look at this picture or as this artifact? And then what actions does that call you to have? Or what actions do you think happened in that scenario? What is it that you're painting? What's the story? What's the narrative that you're creating? It's only by knowing the narrative that each of our students holds that we can help them to change that narrative. And especially for our Black and Brown students, to change that narrative to be one of equity and to be one where their voice and they have is heard and where there's student agency. And so what we've created with RISE is an additional tool, which also, again, we'll make sure everyone on the Zoom tonight has access to this tool, which is similar to the primary source analysis tool, but different and very aimed at diversity, equity, and inclusion, which asks students those 3 questions of what do you feel, what do you believe, and what are the actions. We also have created guides that go along with this tool. And we really truly hope everyone on this call can enroll in the micro-credential. Within the micro-credential, you'll get an experience where you can get a sample lesson using these tools. And you'll also have the tools access on your own so that you can apply them in your classroom. David?
So before I mention sort of talking more generally, I just wanted to really commend everybody in the chat. So like watching this process play out in real time is very, very exciting. And what you're doing in the chat is exactly the way this would work with your students, which is all these really excellent observations, really thin slicing what you're looking at in the image. So people noting that the depictions of the Black family are kind of stereotypical, that the figure in the doorway is holding a gun and wearing a hood, and then people jump to maybe thinking about significance. So is this kind of reminiscent of the Klan, right? Is this an attack on this family? Wondering who drew it, wondering, was this based on a real event or something like that? So that's sort of the source analysis. And then this very seamless transition to really deeper, difficult questions about how incidents like this are still happening today. How one person mentioned how this would probably add to some degree to the trauma that your students of color feel, right? That this is a very sensitive image that you have to really scaffold before kind of dropping in your student's lap. Thinking about things like police incursions, right? So the video that just came out a couple of days ago of the woman who, the police stormed into her house and it wasn't even the right house. The Breonna Taylor case, things like this are the kind of questions you'd have to sort of dig into. So I think you're getting an excellent sense of how this can work. And so to answer just a couple of the questions, that image and this one, which came out shortly thereafter, is by Thomas Nast, who's a very famous political cartoonist. He's the one who creates the Republican elephant. The modern vision of Santa Claus is based on his cartoons. And he creates a number of cartoons about the South in the post-Civil War period because he's a very ardent anti-slavery advocate. And so he creates those cartoons, and it was indeed the Ku Klux Klan. The first cartoon is called Visit of the Ku Klux. And so a cartoon like this, you can use to kind of backstop that first one and provide a little more context, right? Whereas the first one is a bit of a dispassionate kind of image of sort of a slice of life, right? He's documenting this very horrific moment. This one has a bit more editorializing. And so the point being that using primary sources, you have a lot of different things available to you, right? That looking at an image like this might be a little bit less traumatic for students because it's a little bit less graphic, it's a little more abstract, that it has a little bit more editorial license taken. So maybe you can go in this direction if you're worried about background knowledge or having your students grasp the significance. So there are so many avenues here available to you. This is just a quick example that we show here to give you a sense of what's possible here and how these give you kind of a direct link to the past. So with that, I'll turn it back to Donna for the next section here.
What we really want to give to you, so that what you just experienced was a direct practical use of primary sources using the RISE method along with the primary source analysis tool, but we want to share with you how to start. And the reality of, how does racism really, and diversity, equity, and inclusion permeate all of our teaching and learning is a process. And Felicia's going to share with you the 3 key points around how you begin this journey.
You begin this journey by first committing to being a part of this personally and being aware of how you're showing up in the world, being aware of how you interact with people of color, not just necessarily inside of your classrooms. Defining what is racism. When you think about racism, what does that look like to you? What is your definition of it? And identifying what your personal goals will be and what's a priority for you when it comes to helping to dismantle what we see and we are experiencing, and people that are Black and brown are experiencing as racism. So as a equity-driven educator, we would like for you to just, again, be open, be aware, and reflect on how you've been showing up in the world.
So in addition to starting personally, so starting with your own personal journey, which was what you're doing tonight by committing this time and committing to engaging with these experiences, we want to model for you too another way to begin with your students. And this is actually something those of you who are going back in January remote teaching can use this exercise right away with your students. Those of you who are principals or presidents can use this with your faculty. We're going to engage all of you in a small breakout session with an exercise for racial equity and diversity called In Order to Know Me. And you'll see in the chat, Brennan has put a document with some questions. There are 4 questions. We're going to break you into small groups of 3 to 4. You won't know these folks typically, but what we'd like to do ask is everyone in the breakout room take a moment to answer each one of the questions one by one. The questions are this: in order to know me, really know me, you need to know that and that really in order to know me, you need to know that when there's tense questions around racism, I feel. And then in questions about and discussions around racism, I think or I do. So that we get to open the door. And there's simple 4 questions that really help our students and will help us to be more vulnerable around our stereotypes and our issues with racism, to begin that journey, so that when we're in front of our kids and we're talking about primary sources and we're helping them to analyze them, we're aware of our own biases and our own inequities in our own life. So what you'll see on your screen in just a second or 2 is an invitation to a breakout room. Please just accept that breakout room invitation. You'll also see in the chat the document. So before you go into your breakout room, if you would just click on that document so that you have those questions in front of you, I will also broadcast them through the breakout room. So you'll get them in a couple of ways. We'll give you there'll be 3 to 4 people in a breakout room. So we'll give you about 6 minutes in the breakout room, and then we'll call you back and you'll be pulled right back in. So hang on, folks, and here we go. And leaders, you don't need to go into those rooms. Hey, Lay, did you get an invitation to a breakout room?
Yes, I did, Dr. Kill.
Could you go in and just make sure that you can see the broadcast message of the questions?
Okay, I'll join the breakout room.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Brennan, can you let Leigh know she doesn't have to stay in there? Just want to make sure that I got the questions to her, to the breakout room.
Oh, okay.
I don't have her cell in front of me.
I don't either.
Oh, okay. Then never mind. I can pull her out, I think. Kind of rude, but I can do that.
Yes, Dr. Kill.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see it. No problem.
And these did not divide up to even.
Dr. Kill, did I see Principal Rodriguez?
You did. He's
Okay.
in a breakout room.
Okay.
He's actually in a room where there's only 2 people because you were supposed to, because it was the room that you were joined in. Well, he'll get to know that person really well. Okay.
Oh my gosh, I have got to thank them. I see Mr. Eccles is here, Ms. Bernard. These are all my teachers from Good.
Anybody notice how much time I gave them?
You gave them 6 minutes, but I don't know when they went.
That's what I meant. I don't know when I did either. And then when they come back, I'll do key break takeaways, Felicia, and then it's you about race. No, it's you. It's Tina. I'm sorry. No, it's Felicia. It's Felicia.
Yeah, I'm toward the end.
Yep.
I don't speak toward the very end.
Yep. And then it goes to Dave. And then it's all the David show. Okay. I'm gonna close the room. 60 seconds. Welcome back, folks.
Bye.
Oh. Hey, Craig. Good to see you. Well, welcome back, everyone. As I said, this is something you can do with your students. It's so essential that with our students, we get to know who they are from different lenses. Sometimes we think as teachers that when we've been teaching students for a semester that we deeply know them, but we know them sometimes just academically, or we know them as members of a community, as sports players, or in the co-curricular. But to know what they think, feel, and believe in response to any kind of diversity, equity, or inclusion issue is vital. to moving ahead with dismantling racism, with really looking at equity. And history gives us the foundation. So I'd encourage all of you to use this exercise with kids, especially students who you want to get to know at a deeper level. I think it's been challenging for those of us teaching remotely to really know our students. And these kinds of experiences can help to open up new doors to them. So in the chat, now that you got to know each other a little bit, and I apologize to a couple of rooms where you just had a couple people. It was weird how the breakout rooms didn't mathematically equally divide, so I apologize. But in the chat, please share any key takeaways or anything you noticed about yourself or about the folks that you met. Typically, when we've done this exercise in the past, what people are amazed at is how open, honest, and vulnerable they're able to be with people they don't know yet, or even with their own colleagues. When we've done this, we do this exercise for individual schools as well. So if your school ever wants to have a deeper dive into RISE, please let us know, and we're happy to do that work with you. But we know that this is a powerful experience to begin that dialogue on a personal level with educators who we work with every day or don't even know about race. And let's talk about what race is. Alicia, do you want to take us on that journey? Unmute yourself.
Thought I was batting 100 this time. Okay, so 95. What is race exactly? When you think about race, what comes to mind? When I think about race, I think about, for example, a grouping of people. It's social types of groups of people. So I'm going to ask you to, when race comes to mind, what do you think about? Do you think about, if you see someone who's Black or brown, is the connection that you make to that?
If you could put that in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah.
If you just put in the chat kind of your definition of race, how you would define race, and thanks, Felicia, so much for sharing your definition of race. And if anybody else, as we're going to learn about the definition of race, if you had to define it right now for your students or for anyone else, how would you do that? How would you define race? And David, you want to begin our journey?
Yeah, so there are different ways of defining race, but the one that we've sort of pulled here is from a standard sociology textbook. So this definition is that race is a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. And so one thing that I've noticed a bunch of in the chat is that all of you are already kind of ahead of us here, right? That race is a social construct, right? And so that is, of course, the most significant thing about race is that it's not actually scientifically or biologically real, right? And so I think that's really important to know. So in terms of ways of getting at this with your students, and especially ways of setting this up historically, if that's how you want to do this with primary sources, there's kind of 4 different aspects of race that I think can make this a little more concrete, right? Because we all understand that race is a social construct, but what does that actually mean in a concrete sense? So one, like we said, it's socially constructed or defined. It is not genetic or biological or scientific. And I think the genetic one there is significant in the way that we think about race socially. So a couple of specific examples here that I can offer you. So one would be just people that we all are familiar with is Tiger Woods, right? So Tiger Woods in the popular imagination, and often in the way he's discussed in media, especially sports media, which is not really caught up to a lot of the more recent discourse on this, Tiger Woods is generally called Black, right? And this is true to an extent, but Tiger Woods, if you really wanted to break this down, right, is a quarter Thai, a quarter Chinese, an eighth Native American, an eighth Black, and a quarter white, right? So he is very much a multiracial person, but he is generally considered kind of in the popular imagination to be Black, right? Another example of this would be President Obama, right? So President Obama is the first Black president, obviously, but we also know that President Obama is biracial, right? And so because President Obama's mother was white, there are some nations in Latin America, for example, where he would be considered racially white. And so the point here is just to say that that all of this is kind of constructed, right? And it's constructed in specific ways that have to do with history in the US and how we think about race here. Another thing that I would add is that it's very easy to define race as skin color, right? Because that's kind of the first thing we think of. That's a trait that's often substituted, but it's not quite the same thing. And I think that this is an example too that can get at the social construction aspect of this. So here are 4 different famous people, okay? Kevin Garnett, Halle Berry, Harold Ford Jr., and Rashida Jones. So all of the people in this image are Black, right? But they obviously look very different from one another. And I think that this is a good example of how skin color is not purely a proxy for race, right? That there's something more to it than that, that it also has to do with your place of ancestry, right? It has to do with certain social constructions around who people are and what their identity is. And obviously this is enormously complex, within communities as well as in society at large, but this is just kind of one way to make this a little more concrete for your students. You can also do this in a different way, which is that Ed Sheeran and Ariana Grande are both white, right? Even though they really do not look anything alike. And so one thing that you might want to think about with your students and interrogate is, when we say that race is socially constructed based on certain physical characteristics, what are the characteristics that have historically been chosen and why, right? I think that's something that we want to think about. Another thing about race too is this one is very challenging for students, but it's maybe the most important in terms of thinking this historically, is that race, what we think of as race, is not permanent or fixed, right? So the way that Americans have thought about race and defined who is white and who is Black, right, depending on who you talk to, has changed significantly over the centuries. So the classic example here historically in the US is Irish immigrants. So when Irish immigrants arrived in the US in the 1840s, they were not considered white. So to get into this would be to go down a serious rabbit hole. They were not considered Black, but they were not considered white. They were not afforded white privilege. And then there's a very long history of how the Irish became white. There's a very famous book with that title. But it's important to note that race is not fixed, right? That historically that can change due to circumstance. But then probably the most important thing is that sometimes you'll hear people in certain quarters say, well, if race is a social construct, then it's not real, right? It's fake. So we don't have to discuss it. We don't have to worry about it. It's not a big deal. And so I think it's important to note with your students that race is not scientifically or biologically real, in that there is no biological difference between people of different skin colors or hair textures or eye colors or whatever else. But that doesn't mean that race is fake, right? That socially speaking and culturally speaking, race is very, very, very real. So for example, I can show you just a quick image here. This is a very infamous image taken by a SNCC organizer in Albany, Georgia in 1962. And so you can see the separate and extremely unequal drinking fountains here. And so if you want to do a thought experiment with someone that tells you, well, race is socially constructed, so it's fake, imagine telling a Black person in Albany, Georgia in 1962, who's forced to drink from this lesser water fountain, that race is fake, right? So race may not be scientifically real, but it's absolutely real in a social sense, and it absolutely structures people's lives in all sorts of ways, and not all of them negative, right? Race can also provide spaces for vibrant and cohesive communities to form. But the point being that if you want to say that race is fake, you want to limit that to the scientific side. But race is also a lived experience that is enormously important to people in terms of the law, of politics, of economics, and it structures lives in very key ways. And so one of your tasks as a teacher is to interrogate what those ways are, how they came to be, and why they're still present today.
So in the chat, if you can share any of your ideas of the key characteristics of racism, now that we kind of have an unpacking of race, what are those characteristics you believe that indicate there's racism present? And Tina, you want to walk us through racism?
I'm sorry, that wasn't the slide that I was expecting to come up.
Okay.
So I was going to be talking about racism. And so here's the thing, as educators and even as school districts, we didn't create racism. We didn't do that. but we perpetuate it. And we perpetuate it through like our own like biases, the stereotypes, the prejudice that we bring to our classrooms. And so when you think about like who are we putting on the AP track, who's on the honors track, who has access to like college credit courses, who's on the vocational track. And so those are the things that we have to start thinking about, because having this information and us going back and not doing anything with it and looking at it in a way where it like, so think about students don't create their own inequities. Like their inequities are created by us, by the system of oppression. Like racism is a system of power, but it's also a system of oppression in school. We just got to name that. School is one of those systems of oppression for our children, where power is used to, like I said, to discriminate against them. And think about like, if we don't like, for me, if we don't take the time to sit with ourselves, hold up a mirror, and like name our prejudice, name our bias, it becomes baggage. And it will manifest itself in how you teach, how you interact with your students, how you engage with your students. And going back to what Dr. Bates was saying earlier about why the primary source documents are like so useful in our teaching, is because of their effectiveness. And crucial to their effectiveness is like how they're able to help us to explain and define racism for our children and how it's changed over time. Also, the power and the potential of the primary sources to help students to see the systems of racial oppression, how they develop over time. And then think about the more students understand about race, racism, and power, and justice, and equity, and inequity, then the more we empower them to act on it. So students can't do things and they can't act on things that they don't understand, that they don't know. And so in teaching them what is race, what is racism, how it's developed, teaching them about systems of oppression, then our students can be empowered to combat racism today. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want to do with their education. We want them to take their education, go out into the world and make a difference and make the world a better place. And by dismantling these systems.
Thanks so much, Tina. So let's remind you of some of the steps that we've shared with you in order to take racism and to create classrooms that are focused on diversity, on equity and inclusion. Begin by having the conversation with your students and use the In Order to Know Me document if that's a way to do it. But beginning by having that personal journey and then getting to know who your students are before you begin teaching about anti-racism and about using primary sources. We have to know where students are and meet them there. Then the second step, a very practical step, is select a primary source aligned with your objectives, whether you're studying African Americans, Latinx, Asian, or Indigenous peoples, their experience, and you want to examine racism and inequity from any lens, select that primary source. What we offer you in the RISE Micro-credential will be a selection of primary sources so you don't have to do the searching. It's another reason we encourage you to take the micro-credential, but we also can share with you those resources. So we've cultivated and discerned resources that can prompt students in having those deeper conversations. And more importantly, we've given you tools with how to engage students in those conversations. And then you begin by analyzing the source. Remember, there's a 2-category strategy. First, we analyze the artifact cognitively. We use the mind and we use intellect. We engage students in that critical thinking, but then we engage the heart and we engage the emotions, and we use empathy and compassion to really look at what do we believe about that primary source? What do we feel about that source? And now, most importantly, how are we called to action because we've unpacked our own biases or our own feelings about it? And for students, it helps them to become those civic activists that our country needs, so that we can, in a very non-political way, allow students to examine history, to learn from the history, and then to create new worlds that are far more equitable, inclusive, and diverse. And so with that, we're going to look at another example. David's going to take us through more deliberately using another primary source. We'd like to again engage you in the chat as David guides you through what you can do with your students, if you too would respond in the chat. Dave?
Okay, so this image is from the 1940s, and this is the county courthouse in Halifax, North Carolina. So what I want to do is the same process we went through before, but slow it down a little bit and kind of go through step by step here. So first, what I'd like is just observations. Okay, so we're on the Library of Congress prompt here. So we're going to do observe, reflect, questions. So the questions at the bottom here, what do you see? So let's start there. Just things you observe, things that strike you just as you look at this photograph, things that jump out at you. Big, small, something that may seem like it's not significant because you never know what we might circle back to later.
Great observations in the chat. The bold colored sign, the student seems uncertain, the person being alone.
Yeah, so the person being alone is significant. I think somebody mentioned the building, right? There's sort of a building on the left-hand side, almost looming over the entire photo. So what are some things that maybe you think about here? So this is a little tougher with a photograph, but what do you think is the significance of this image? What do you think the photographer is trying to say? Because photographs, just like documents, can have a thesis and a point of view. And what are some other things that you might draw out of this image just in terms of what it might mean, why it might be significant?
I love what one of our participants says, it's more that she's more concerned about what she doesn't see. And that's, you know, hoping to take our students to that deeper dive as well.
Yeah, so I'm very glad that that was pointed out, because sometimes historians call this reading the silences. But one of the most significant things you can ask your students to do in this stage when you're analyzing is ask them, what do you not see, right? What point of view is not represented? Whose voice is not being heard? Somebody else said that the sign being on a tree is almost reminiscent of a lynching, which I think is a terrific connection to make here. Yeah, the person complying, right? So what's the story of the person at the center, this young person at the center of the image? Is the photographer normalizing this, right? What's the photographer's point of view? And then what are some questions you have? What are some things you wonder about? Some things that are not clear about the image, about the photographer, about the context? So a person who hasn't known anything but this, like that observation.
Is the water safe to drink? What a great thing to wonder about.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially what we know now about the way certain communities are deprived of resources like clean water, right? Do we know anything about how clean this water is? Excellent, excellent point. Did this person consent to have their picture taken? We have no way of knowing that, but that's such a crucial question, right? That completely changes the conception of the image based on that answer. Yeah, that the person is separated from the seat of power, right? That there's a huge looming symbol of power, but this person is removed from it physically, right? There's clearly a distance there.
A great point about, you know, pictures of perhaps the famous picture of white students pouring milkshakes on Black students, you know, and how that would make our Black, Indigenous, people of color students feel differently. It's a great point. It's something to really talk about in terms of how do we select the images and what's the cultural relevance of the images that we select. And one of the authors that Tina and Felicia and David and I often use the work of is Goldie Muhammad and her culturally relevant pedagogical framework, which really talks about always considering, just as our participants said, the relevance to the lives of the students that we're teaching.
Absolutely. And that's a huge question. And that's one that really is going to depend on you and your students. Is, like you said, selecting the images, selecting the documents that you use, and doing so in a way that is effective, but also sensitive, right, is crucially important. So to flip to our next stage, to the rise portion of this. So what are some things that you believe about this image, right? Some things that you feel. That's a really significant stage here. You can also try to exercise what we call historical empathy too, and try to think about the person in the photo. What are they thinking, right? Excellent point about technology, that there's a huge difference between black and white and color photographs, right? In terms of how things are perceived, to the basic level of something like skin tone and how different that is. And I was actually just reading an article about this a couple of weeks ago, that there are actually a large number of colorized photos or color photos from the 50s and 60s. And I think that often we see the civil rights movement in black and white film or black and white photographs. And that gives us such a sense of distance from that time. And the person in the article was arguing for historians to use more color photographs to give us more immediacy, that this is really not that long ago, and you don't want to do a disservice to your students.
It's also really significant when we've worked with the what do you believe, what do you feel, what do you think actions are happening, is to really help students and help yourselves to unpack those feelings, because we often don't know what we felt because of whatever, if we've been subjected to racism, if we've been the victim, or if we've been the perpetrator, or we've been an observer, and we've not been an upstander when it comes to racism, we may have suppressed those feelings. So being able to talk about those feelings as they relate to our beliefs. Do I believe this child is in danger? Do I believe that this is the past and not the present? Do I believe that this can't happen now? You know, what are those beliefs, and can we unpack those?
So somebody's mentioning generational trauma here, right? Mm-hmm. And thinking about how this can reverberate. I can share a little bit here how this is taken in Halifax, North Carolina, which is about 40 miles away from where my mother's family grew up and had lived there for generations. And I would absolutely love to sit here and say that they were different than the other white people in North Carolina at this time and fought against this, but that's just not true. It's not true at all. And so I think it's important to identify those feelings and, you know, how these things historically were constructed and how they're still with us today in all sorts of different forms.
Some really great questions in the chat. And Craig, you're absolutely right. Think about that lead in the water lines in the schools in Chicago today. And think about, you know, some people who did grow up during that time, and what did they feel and what did they think, and how we can learn from those. When we start to ask those questions about what did someone feel? What did the people in the picture feel? What do you feel? What did you think they believed? What did this little child believe back then? You know, what would we believe now? We help to use history to inform the future. And as we get ready to close out today, I'm going to turn it over to Tina, as she has a call to action for all of us.
So first, I want to acknowledge you taking the time out on the Thursday. For those of us who are in the classroom, it is like coming up tomorrow, our last day. Just the fact that you are here speaks volumes to where you are in your journey. And this is a really big step. And so we know that hopes and dreams are not enough alone. They're not insufficient by themselves without action. And so we want you to think about just something small thing, or even a very large thing that you can do that will make whatever your personal vision for racial equity become a reality. And just think about, what is it that you are willing to commit to doing today with a sense of urgency.
And so another call to action, that I would love to share with all of you is to register for our micro-credential. It's a free program for teachers funded by the Barra Education Foundation's grant with the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. We would love for all of you on the call, or any educator that you're associated with, to take part in the micro-credential. It's a powerful learning experience where you can become that agent of change who makes a difference in the future. You will earn not only CPDUs, but again, a digital badge that demonstrates your significance as a racial equity educator. And if you don't want to do the micro-credential, you're always welcome to attend the monthly webinars that will follow along with RISE. Our session today focused on reflection and a bit of inquiry. We'll go deeper into inquiry and part of self-awareness in our next webinar. Those dates are up on the screen. There will be a link in the chat, and we'll email you as well a form to register for the micro-credential that just asks email and some identifying information. You'll get access to the micro-credential, which then you can begin. The greatest thing about the micro-credential is that it's self-paced. You can work on it as quickly or as slowly as you need to, especially knowing the uncertainty of our schedules these days. And you can have the time that you need to complete it. You'd receive coaching and mentoring of the DePaul faculty, and also receive a host of resources for your school. So with that, I again want to thank the Bear Education Foundation and Sheila Smith, as well as Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program, my DePaul colleagues and our adjuncts of DePaul, and each of you for giving your time today. We will post the recording of tonight, so if you have colleagues you want to pass that along to, and if there is anything that we can ever do for any of you along the lines of racial equity, we would be happy to do so. So thank you so much for your attendance tonight, and have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Dr. Keel.
Thank you. Thank you, Leigh.
Thank you. This was really good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Principal Rodriguez. Good to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. It was really nice. Thank you.
I'd like to personally thank you, Dr. Keel, Mr. Bates, and I missed Dr. Curry, but I really enjoyed this webinar and I look forward to the next one. I'm going to consider the micro-credential journey. I've got a few other items on my list, so I'll see, but I will definitely consider pursuing it.
Well, thank you,
Mr. Eccles. I miss you so much. I'm so glad you turned your camera on so I can see you. Hi. I miss you.
Yeah, this has been this is actually probably one of the most difficult semesters I have ever had, and I'm sure that goes along with everyone else. But the first 2 months, September and October, were extremely difficult and stressful, I will say. But it's gotten better, and so I look forward to this.
Thank you. We'll have to catch up.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank you.
all you're doing for education and for hanging in there. It's been, you know, teachers have the hardest job, I think, right now. So thank you, Mr. Eccles, and thanks for joining us. I hope you take the micro-credential. It might be that little breath of fresh air you need.
It really it may be. I'll try. Have happy holidays. Be safe.
Thank
and
you.
enjoy yourselves.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye.
Oh my gosh, I had people from National Louis, Good, and Educators for Excellence.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Whole lot of Catholic school educators. So that's great.
Well, I want to thank you all. I enjoyed it. And David, it's good to see you again, even if it's virtually.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, we're glad to have you working with us on this project, all of you, Tina again, and Felicia, and of course, Donna. And Brennan, I have to have you take a picture of me so I can put something like that up. Okay.
Yeah, it's very suave, sophisticated.
Yeah, it looks great.
I'd like you to meet too Leigh Mao, who's our graduate assistant, who's helping us out this year. She's in our PhD program, our doctoral program, our ed.
That's wonderful. listening to this and how you've structured it is terrific, because it takes me back to my early days and with my parents, who were very much on the social justice front. And I have to share something. We grew up with experiences with Black educators, lawyers, never with an Asian. And when I entered a program at Notre Dame, a fun thing to date someone, I was paired with an Asian and I was scared to death. And I actually ended up doing business with Asians. But my dad explained that part of discrimination is fear of the unknown. And one of the teachers mentioned that with one of his students. So I'm just so glad we're taking this on, and that you're going to broaden it as well as Blacks, but also showing how it can relate to Latinx or Asians or Native Americans, you know.
Yeah.
So
it's amazing, Sheila. David has pulled out incredible primary sources in every category. So it came up for Tina today. So we're happy to kind of expand that to include all
this is, I just can't thank you enough. This means so much to me. And Donna, you know, I sent you that book, and if you guys don't have it, we have extras. I'd be pleased.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Send you First Principles by Tom Ricks, because it talks about one of the comments made, and I will get off because it's been a long day for all of you and I appreciate it. But the nation, our nation, was founded on the acceptance of slavery. Slavery was not a stain on on our country. It was woven into the social fabric.
Wow.
And when you think about that, it is, you know, and it's a great book, because it talks about it. Really, he talks about the principles of the founders from Greek and Roman times, but that permeates throughout the book, the whole issue of how we were formed and how we've evolved. So I guess that's the good thing. We can leave on a positive note. At least we've evolved. Now, maybe not far enough, but you guys are terrific. So I'm looking forward to it. I don't need the micro-credential, Donna, but I do need to be exposed to you guys more and more. It gives me hope.
Thanks.
So have a safe holiday and a joyful holiday.
You as well. Thank you.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.